Now, friends, this right here is a site plan of what is now the first few blocks of downtown St. Pete. And it was submitted by a man named Peter Demons, not Demon, but Demens. If you've ever been down to Demons Landing before in downtown St. Pete, that park is named after this gentleman who submitted the site plan for St. Pete. Now, this was in 1888, a little bit changed since then, but by 1892, 4 years later, St. Petersburg officially became designated as a town. You know how many people lived in St. Petersburg in 1892? Close, 300 people, only 300. And by 1903, it became a city officially, and it had 1,600 people. Now, just as a point of reference, in 1903, St. Petersburg was 1 square mile, but by 1925, 13 years later, it had grown to 50 square miles. Now, apparently, somebody up north and somebody in the Midwest, they heard about this place for retirees down in St. Pete, right, where you could go. There was warm weather. It was great. And so during the 1920s, 1930s, people just started flooding down to St. Pete. And so a lot of the homes, especially on the east side of town, they were built in the 20s, the 30s, a little earlier than that. And then after World War II, all the soldiers came home, and there were all these families that started popping up here, and so they built more homes. In fact, most of us here today, we probably have a home that was built between 1947 and 1952. And friends, because St. Pete was growing at such a great rate, remember St. Pete downtown is on the east side. Down there, St. Pete started growing to the north, it started growing to the south, and for our purposes today, it also started growing to the west. In fact, take a look at this. This is a map from 1947, and as you can see there on the right-hand side, that red shaded area, that's the city limit of St. Petersburg. Over the decades, it continued to push westward and westward and westward. But notice there, it had not reached that red circled area there where our Savior would eventually be built on that land. Now, meanwhile, on the east side of St. Pete, there was a church called Grace Lutheran. Grace Lutheran was established in 1927, and for several decades, especially if you were a Lutheran, that's the church that you went to. And so during that time, it was very popular. People would go there. Well, during the 1950s, particularly 1954, there was a small group of members at Grace who had moved out to these new neighborhoods in West St. Pete. And friends, they came across a problem and an opportunity. The problem was that now that they were living over in West St. Pete, Grace Lutheran was actually kind of far. Now today, you drive to Grace, it's about 15 minutes, but back in the 1950s, driving from the east side of St. Petersburg to the west side, it wasn't like driving to Judea or Samaria. It was like driving to the ends of the earth. And so that was the problem. The opportunity was that there were all these new neighborhoods of people to share the message of salvation with. In other words, they thought, hey, wouldn't it be awesome to plant a church in West St. Pete where people could come to hear about the saving work of Jesus Christ? And so, friends, take a look. On February 7th, 1954, this small group of members from Grace, they held their first evening service at Gulfport Elementary. Now, the reason it was an evening service was because the pastor at Grace, he preached at Grace in the morning, and then he came and preached in the evening here at Gulfport Elementary. And so these 18 members over time, after about a month or two, they ended up calling their first pastor, take a look, his name was Pastor Bruce Bartholomew. And now that they had a pastor, they didn't have to have an evening service in the morning, they could have a morning service. And so their first morning service was on Easter Sunday of 1954. And friends, later that week, the 18 members of Our Savior, they founded and chartered Our Savior Lutheran Church. In fact, take a look. These are those 18 members who began Our Savior back in 1954. And friends, over time, Our Savior, it continued to grow. They kind of outgrew their classroom space at Gulfport Elementary. They eventually moved to the Gulfport Community Hall later that fall. And friends, by early 1954, take a look, with the help of the Synod, they purchased a piece of property on 58th Street and 4th Avenue South. Friends, you know how much it cost back then? It was $11,500. That's like 96 of these t-shirts. I'll get over this one day, I promise. Now, at that time, take a look, they started a groundbreaking service to break ground on this new sanctuary that they were going to build. 98 members, 28 kids in Sunday school. Now, as they did that, they started to build it. Then, take a look, by the end of 1955, November 27th, the first Our Savior Sanctuary was built. And friends, for the next 11 years, they would worship in this building every Sunday together. Now, cool fact, this building still exists today. It's not this one here. In fact, if you leave here today, you go outside, it's the building directly to the west of the church. Does anybody know what we use that building for today? It's our middle school building. Now, take a look as you can see here on the map. Here's the point. By the end of 1955, the good news of salvation, the message of salvation, had traveled from the Mount of Olives to Jerusalem, to Judea, to Samaria, all the way to 301 58th Street South in St. Petersburg, Florida. And so, friends, this brings us back to our question this morning. Take a look. How did our Savior begin? And the answer is that it began when a small group of believers faithfully carried out Jesus' mission from Acts chapter 1 by planting a church in West St. Pete in 1954.